work for Babcock, and we do two things, I suppose. The first thing we do is we service Devon County Council's safeguarding across the county. So that's half of my job, I suppose, and the other half is to work with schools who commission us to support them, such as the St Christopher's Trust. So it's really is good to be working with you today. Just totally echo what Ian said about thanking you for giving your time up this morning, and that the pressure is very definitely on me because this better be useful. So I'm sure you'll tell me at the end if it's not, but equally as we go along, it's really important that you're comfortable to ask questions. The only caveat I would add to asking questions is we're going to take a break somewhere around 11:30 for probably a quarter of an hour, so hopefully get a bit of time away from the screen, chance to get a drink and a comfort break. But if I do kind of move conversations on, it's purely because of timings. And what I would just encourage you to do is either come back through Ian if you've got subsequent questions, or indeed I'm very happy. I'll put my email address in the chat so that if you need to get in touch with me. So why am I doing this training today? Well, I suppose Ian, are you happy to pop the slides up for us? Is that okay? Thank you. My background has been in school. I've never left school really. I think I started there when I was 5 and kind of had a couple of years swanning around at university, but then kind of went straight back into school as a teacher. Made it to head teacher where I stayed for 10 years before coming and doing this job. The other thing is I'm also a governor myself at the moment at a secondary school. So I hope what I've got today in terms of what I'm going to try and achieve with you in the next couple hours is not just the kind of the legislation, because as somebody ably said, I can read. Absolutely, it's how you interpret that legislation sometimes, and also what does the picture around you look like that, as for a good number of you will know, in the last 18 months has moved so dramatically, so quickly. But even before then, we're always on that kind of trying to keep on top of what's going on in education. I'm sure a number of you in other fields will have exactly the same experience. So I hope what today is, as it says here, is a kind of a look at what's it going to look like when hopefully we can get back into schools, accepting that some of you might have started that, accepting that some of you no doubt will have been involved, having conversations throughout the lockdown period. But this session really is aimed at that. So without trying to sound like Jonathan Van Tam, my new superhero, could I have the next slide, please, Ian? Thank you very much. So really, just to kind of clarify that, we as in myself working with your schools and with Ian as my direct link through the trust, have been continuing to visit, sometimes virtually, sometimes in person, the schools throughout this period. So please don't think that there's kind of been a gulf in that support. And I think Ian uses this phrase both accurately and continually, which is in partnership. I think one of the things that we have established we're a provider, we're a service, but I do think that we've really established a partnership. And I hope I was heartened to hear Richard's comment about how he felt about a visit to his school, and that's really reassuring. However, one of the things that these visits throughout this period have really identified is that actually a number of governors, in particular those governors who are in the safeguarding role, and I appreciate some of you are, some of you aren't, and after today, who knows, some of you then might be, because somebody might turn around and say, well, you've done some training, wouldn't that be a great thing for you to do? We've recognised that actually we're in a little bit of a kind of a vacuum at the moment, where some of that previous monitoring, that evaluation work just hasn't been able to take place. So this session today really has been commissioned. This isn't an off-the-shelf session. Sorry, this has been very specifically designed. Ian and I have kind of talked through the contents, and hopefully we'll meet all of your requirements. But please, as I say, do ask questions as we go. One final thing: it's not death by PowerPoint. None of my training ever is, because goodness gracious me, that would be a crime in itself. So there are going to be lots of opportunities for you to kind of talk to each other. Ian is also the master of breakout rooms. If you haven't experienced a virtual breakout room yet, they effectively enable you to have a conversation with others that's separate to the main conversation. So there'll be lots of opportunity for you to talk to each other's feedback, and obviously ask myself and indeed Ian questions as we go. So that's quite important. Just one final thing: most safeguarding training that I would do would have a degree of contents around what we're going to refer to as signs and symptoms. In other words, some of the things that are actually happening to some of the young people that attend some of your schools. We're not doing that today. But if there are things today, if there is anything that affects you personally, then all I would just say is please, do kind of get in touch with someone or somebody who can help and support. Sometimes training of this nature does trigger events either for family members, friends, or indeed individuals. So that's important to recognise that as well. Okay, boss, next slide, please. Thank you very much. So Just a couple of things. I'll explain what I mean by each of these. Um, Governance, having worked with governors, obviously as a head teacher, now as a governor myself, and obviously delivering training through my role, I see very much governance as eyes on, hands off. What I mean by that is at no point today, or indeed through your role as a governor, should we be talking about individual children or families, because that very much is the role for the professionals, that designated safeguarding lead. Often the head teacher is the same person, or indeed members of the safeguarding team. And therefore, I think that eyes on, hands off is a helpful phrase to remind us that as governors, we need to be looking at safeguarding in a very different way. So it's that overview, it is about policy and procedure. And please, 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 today, no such thing as a silly question. A good number of you have got previous safeguarding experience. Let's be honest, everyone's got safeguarding experience because the news, the media, just our life does encourage us to think safeguarding questions at times. But please, there are no silly questions. There are only questions that you individually don't know the answer to. And I guarantee if you're thinking that, somebody else will be as well. I'm going to desperately try to avoid that uncomfortable jargon and acronym game that sometimes we play. But if I do slip in the occasional three letters and somebody thinks, what does he mean? Do pick me up on that. But I've desperately tried through both the slides and through the way that I'll talk to not do that. So that's kind of hopefully useful as well. Okay, next slide, please, Ian. Thank you. These slides are available to you after today, so absolutely, please get hold of them if you need them. Equally, somebody was saying about certificate. I'm sure Ian will produce that, but in some ways the slides are kind of that. But I appreciate it having one document saves on that. So these are the kind of key questions that I think all of us, regardless of our role, whether we're a new governor, whether we're an established governor, whether we're a trustee director, whether we're a member of staff, is this is basically what it's about, isn't it? Our children and adults safe at school. Now, when I say safe, we need to interpret that in a number of different ways, and hopefully we'll get through some of that today. But again, you'll be very familiar with an awful lot of that. Are adults who work with children, and when we say work with children, yes, of course, we're thinking of employees, but some of you will have started, your volunteers, but some of you will have started to see how volunteers, hopefully, are starting possibly to come back into school. So when we think about adults and working with children, yes, of course, we're talking about employees, and we will do a bit of a session today on the single central record, the SCR as it's often known, and we'll look at kind of how you as a perhaps governor can support the monitoring, the checking of that document, and of course those personnel files that sit alongside it. So that's going to be crucial. And then the final question is this again is an absolute bedrock of our purpose, isn't it? Do the adults know what they're looking for? Ultimately, if we're not curious to the things that we see around us, how possibly can we move to the next step, which is, of course, do they know what to do with those concerns? In each of the schools that you work with, there will be systems in place where a named adult, often the designated safeguarding lead, will be collecting all that information. Good for them. The problem is, of course, they're only as good as the information that gets shared with them. So we need to establish as a governing board that actually those two very basic principles are really well established. Clearly, staff training, it has got a massive role in that. So that's where we're going to head with that. And then that final question is really one for you to reflect on, and I hope by the end of today, by the end of this training, you'll have got for some of you, an improved perhaps picture. For some of you, a very different look at this. But how can we evidence these questions? Because quite frankly, one of the things I think that has perhaps happened in the last 18 months is quite rightly governors have adopted that supportive model for schools, in particular school leadership, in a time of unprecedented challenge. And I think we would absolutely recognise that's the right thing to do. I think we do, though, need to start moving back to a time now where we're asking the questions, so what? Prove it. And I don't mean that in an aggressive, I don't mean that in a kind of like, I don't believe you. But ultimately, by being that kind of critical friend, as some of you will have heard of in the role of governance, part of our role is actually to ask the checkers, i.e. the staff, that we are checking them. And what that means, of course, is that's how you, as a governing board, really do support your leaders in moving that forward. So that's kind of the framework of the questions where we're going today. Okay, next slide, please, Ian. If I think very much around then how you're going to develop that to your particular school, your setting, or indeed those of you that kind of look at the kind of the trust as a whole piece, I think then if we drill down into a bit more detail, we can start to ask ourselves these. So, what are the areas of strength of the school? And when I say strength, I mean it within obviously safeguarding, but what are the things that we would recognise as strengths? Because there are going to be challenges, and some of those challenges are going to be very recent to the last kind of 16, 18 months. And therefore, what's the focus of the school currently? For a number of schools, they've moved through at incredible pace. The kind of the lockdowns where schools were open partially to kind of key worker children or indeed vulnerable children, of course, would fill in here. But equally, what for many schools, they've actually learned huge things from that, and their practices are going to have changed to be now strengths moving forward. And I think it's not just about looking backwards and saying, goodness, wasn't that difficult? I think we're at the stage now we can say, look what we've learned and look what we'll keep doing. So we must have that in mind. But there are challenges, that there are aspects that we're going to need to focus. Those next steps, what are they? How are we making improvements? One of the things that most of us would recognise is that schools are very fluid places. They never stand still. They can't. If we're standing still, we're by default almost moving backwards. So, what is it that we're doing to improve those things? And of course, the key question is, so what's the impact on that? And again, if we're thinking about impact, sometimes we can measure that very handily in numbers. Sometimes we can measure that in reports. And I'm going to do a kind of a little bit of thought process around with you about how else do we measure things? How can we allow ourselves sometimes to say, it feels really right here. This feels good. What does good feel like? And I think it's important that as governors, as those of you that visit schools and will hopefully be visiting more often, that we also can report on that as well. I think fundamentally, for most of us, if we walk into somewhere that doesn't feel safe, we know what that feels like and we can express that. I think we also need to recognise when the opposite is true and how we are confident to share that as well. So we'll head in that direction a little bit as well. Thank you, Ian. Next slide, please. Great. So a little bit of kind of contents. We're going to stick to this in terms of the slides, but please, there's no waiting with these. I'm deliberately going to focus in a little bit on inspection today, and obviously Ofsted. It is because of two reasons. One, because for a number of you that will be in your mind, and when I say it will be in your mind, some of your schools will be waiting for an inspection. Some of you will be thinking, well, hang on a minute, I'm not sure. So that might be a question to take back with you. But also we need to make sure that we recognise that what Ofsted are going to look at in our schools is actually what we, to a degree, can be and indeed arguably should be looking at as well. So the two align nicely. Therefore, it'll give us a little bit of a kind of a framework in that one. We're going to look at, therefore, what they would be looking at, and I hope you'll be able to interpret some of those messages for, therefore, the types of things that you not just might be looking at, but also might be feeding back to the broader local governing board or indeed up through the structure. That's, I hope, helpful. COVID, I am going to cover a little bit of ground on COVID because obviously we do need to think about, well, what might we be asking to see to demonstrate that safeguarding is effective through this period. I know we've had lots of conversations with school leaders, a number of you, but I think now is a great chance to kind of formulate that a little bit and really have a clear understanding. Culture is such an important word, and it's such an important word when we think of safeguarding, because ultimately safeguarding is not a tick list. Safeguarding is not a, well, we got 5 out of 6, therefore we're okay. It's really important that we all understand that actually it is the culture of safeguarding, and an effective and a robust culture of safeguarding. I think it was Simon that said, there have been regular failings, sadly, that if we look back through the media over the last 4 or 5 years, we can pick a number of organisations, and sadly, I suspect that will continue. But our organisation needs to have that robust and effective culture that also reflects on what it does and how it does things better as and when they need to. So that, I hope, will be kind of something that we'll all take away with it. Evidence, it's sometimes difficult to say, well, what should we be having as evidence? And there's no right or wrong here to a degree. But I hope today you'll get a chance both to share that with each other in terms of what you currently see as evidence, but perhaps more importantly, some things that therefore you might be able to go away from today and think, well, actually, how could that be shared? How could that be collected? How could that be used to verify what I think already, and indeed what broader information we get from others who go to school? And as I said, there is I've put a final slide for questions. What I would encourage you to do is I'll kind of try and break at regular occasions and say, have you got any questions? So if you can hear a bit of background noise here, somebody's leaving today and they're just saying their farewell. So I'll probably dive into a room in a minute so I close the door on that. But it's really important that you do ask questions, and I'll give you those opportunities as we go. Okay. So next slide, please, Simon. Next slide, please, Ian.
On the subject of questions, John, there's a question from Graham here about safeguarding as a way of life.
Yeah.
I don't know if you could see the chat there, John, at all.
Yeah, I've just put it up. Yeah, so safeguarding where like eating eye, it's always there and does not have to think about it. You suddenly find it kicks in. Okay, yeah. One wonders if we should take action, but what action? Yeah, Graham, it's a really good question, and I think safeguarding just gets described in lots of ways. I think the golden thread is a phrase that I've heard in the past. It's you should be able to feel it and see it and everything. Equally, safeguarding doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen because, well, it just does. It happens because of the kind of the clear knowledge, guidance, and dedication of school staff, but also as a result of some pretty robust documents that you'll be familiar with. So I do hope, Graham, as we go through today, that your kind of statement there, as well as your question, will become both kind of confirmed, but also be absolutely clarified in some of the things that we should, and actually, as importantly, should not be doing as governing boards. So I hope in part that answers. And as I say, if at the end I haven't been able to kind of quantify that, then do come back and ask a question. That's all. Okay, Ian, thank you very much. So a nice little nod to legislation, and I promise I'm not going to take you through endless. In fact, this is it for legislation today. So there it is. Keeping children safe in education is our predominant go-to document. There are others that we quite rightly need to look at. I need to be making sure schools have got awareness of, but keeping children safe is our kind of go-to. Still broken down into 5 parts with lots of annexes. There will be a new version of this in September 2021. And this is the kind of bit, I suppose, that I really wanted to draw your attention to. And as I said, I'm not going to read slides to you, and I'm going to read this one because I think I just want to capture the essence of it. Governing bodies and proprietors. So this is for all schools. This is not about whether you're an academy or maintained, a fee-paying school. This is all schools. Should ensure that there are appropriate policies and procedures in place in order for appropriate action to be taken in a timely manner to safeguard and promote children's welfare. Now, that really does kind of cover in so many ways what we're going to spend our time doing today. So, well, there are other, that's paragraph 62 if you want to reference it within the document. But I think it really does capture that governing bodies, while you are not doing this on a day-to-day basis, quite rightly, that's the role of professionals such as DSL, safeguarding leads and teachers. But we need to know that these things are in place. And that really is a steer here to say the conversation we're going to have today, the potential actions in terms of your visits and what you asked to see, look at, and the conversations you have are appropriate because of this statement. You have to know, because there it is. You are responsible for it. Well, that's not as an individual. Please don't think as the safeguarding governor, if that's you, that you're carrying that on your shoulders. It's governing bodies. And I think, as with most of your work as local governing boards, and indeed through your structure, that's important that we understand where that is and where perhaps. So that's where we're coming from. Okay, next slide, please. So a question that I'm going to leave you to ask while I go and find a room where I've closed door so you don't get that background conversation of somebody who's leaving. And again, Ian, I don't know if you want to allow people to have a chance to kind of touch base with each other in the breakout room of sizes that you see fit. But question is what are the barriers to your safeguarding role? And I think we can perhaps turn around to each other and say, well, COVID, absolutely. And because we haven't been in school, but actually I hope you can have 5 minutes just to expand on that a little bit more, because it hasn't just been COVID, has it? Think about some of the perhaps changes that schools have needed to adopt. Think about some of the kind of the ways in which they've needed to react to that. And perhaps more importantly, because that's what's happened, we are, I hope, and I say I hope, like all of us, moving towards a time where slowly but surely, not necessarily in a kind of straight line, we're moving towards things returning to not normal, because there will never be a normal in that regard again, but what are going to be the potential challenges for moving that role forward when perhaps we are not as restricted by some of the things that COVID has taught us over the last kind of 12, 18. Ian, is that comfortable if we set those rooms up and I'll go and move quickly into somewhere else? Is that all right?
Yes, I'm just going to pause the recording and
I'll disappear and rejoin then very quickly. Okay. Ian started the recording again as well. Brilliant. So, next slide if I can, please, sir. Thank you. So inspections, what do we know about Ofsted, and why is it pertinent to this? I'm going to try and make the connection because for all of you, Ofsted isn't certainly not why we're doing safeguarding, but what we know, of course, is that, that there is a connection between the two. So we know that inspections have been taking place throughout the period. Some of those have been initially virtually. They've been monitoring visits. They've been visits whereby Ofsted have asked questions of school leaders about how they're providing learning online, how they're making sure that those children, as defined to a degree by local authorities through DfE expectations, that are vulnerable, how we're making sure they're still accessing education, and so on and so forth. But more recently, we've seen those come into schools, and they are starting to become more and more kind of timely in terms of in Devon at the moment. We have somewhere, apologies, I'm talking about Devon, but that's where can get information from. We're seeing somewhere between 2 or 3 a week at the moment of on-site visits. These are monitoring inspections predominantly of schools that their previous judgment was either requiring improvement or judged to be inadequate. So they're very much on the, I'm just pulling a phrase here from a recent summary inspection, are leaders taking effective actions to enable the school to be good at its next full inspection? Now, these are very much monitoring visits at this stage. And therefore, what they're thinking very much along the lines of at the moment is that in September, the information that I understand is that we're going to be seeing those graded inspections. So some of you will be familiar with terms Section 5, Section 8 inspections, but basically where, as a result of that inspection, it is going to confirm the school's current grading, so a Section 8 inspection of a good school, or indeed a full inspection, as it's often deemed as Section 5, where there can be a change in grade. So, for instance, a school perhaps that currently is requiring improvement, to move to good, it needs what's called a Section 5 inspection. And we're expecting those to happen from September. Now, again, and like most things, nobody has got an absolute kind of cast iron guarantee of that, because quite simply, clearly things could change. But we also need to remember that as of before we went into the pandemic, outstanding schools were again being inspected by Ofsted. Some of you all know that outstanding school inspections didn't take place unless there were flagged concerns for a good number of years. Some outstanding schools we know in Devon have gone without inspection for somewhere between 12 and 13 years. So we are seeing more and more outstanding schools being inspected as well. Okay, great. Ian, next slide if I can, please. So we're not due inspection. So why am I saying this? Why am I raising this as a useful point? Well, one of the things that we do know is that Ofsted's purpose and practice when it comes to safeguarding inspections is very much aligned to the requirements that we've probably got a decent understanding of in keeping children safe in education. And quite simply, I would come back to that word culture. What any inspection is going to do is it's going to be looking at the culture of the school, and it's going to be very much establishing through a whole means of information what that culture is that is providing an effective environment. And that's really, regardless of how we view that in terms of the types of things they do, it is very much that culture that we want to. So I think it's very useful for us to have a bit of an understanding of that in terms of some of that inspection activity, so that we've got, as I've described here, a bit of a template. In other words, well, which of these things are reasonable for the governing board to perhaps engage in, especially as we move back into a time where we can be on site. So that's kind of where I'm going to take us in the next few slides, and I'm going to ask you in a minute to do a bit of kind of research of your own to see what your thoughts are for the school that you're supporting. Okay, next slide, please. So some of you will have been through the inspection process in terms of support for school. Some of you will have not. So let's just build it up from kind of ground up, and please say join in as we go. So when we are thinking about inspection, there is going to be activity that goes on before the school has been contacted, and the named inspector will have the school kind of given to them in terms of this is the date of the inspection, usually 4 to 6 weeks before the actual inspection takes place. So there's going to be quite an amount of information that the inspector is going to be looking at, and I've detailed some of that here. So they're going to have information on any reported data, and of course at the moment performance data isn't necessarily that, but certainly things like attendance. Well, what does that tell us at the moment? Probably not the picture that it once did. Certainly we're going to be looking at the previous inspection report. Is there anything within that inspection report from the last time the school was inspected to make any kind of comments around safeguarding. Equally, we're going to be looking very much, are there any complaints that are linked to that school? They will be logged on the school's kind of portal, as it's referred to. And I'm going to be looking at the website in some detail, and I'm going to ask you to have a go at that in a minute. Guide you hopefully with some questions to go away, have a look and feedback, because websites have become more and more important as a view of the school from afar about the culture of safeguarding. So give you a chance today to have a look at that and come back and give some feedback, but also to ask any questions. Clearly, arrival on site. So we're now, this is the day. Most of you will be familiar that you will be phoned the day before you're going to be inspected, or the head teacher will. There will be quite a lengthy conversation, a 90-minute conversation with the head teacher. But it's really important that we then think about, as inspectors or inspector arrive, what is it they get? What is it they see? What is it they feel from things like site security? If somebody mentioned about gates, you're absolutely right. If you're seeing a gate that doesn't look safe or doesn't look like it's been cared for very much in the last 10 years, then I suspect an inspector will pick up on that as well. Signage is a simple one, but it's very important. Do visitors know where to go? And what are those procedures like when actually we go into school? What is it that it's like to be told the things that we need to be told? Am I given a lanyard? What about my mobile device? All of those other things that probably before lockdown were really well practiced, and that for some schools that they might need to kind of reaffirm that is the case when anybody visits that learning perspective. Inspectors are going to look at the single central record. It'll be one of the first things that they do, and they're going to cross-reference that with personnel files. We'll cover that off in a separate part of this training today and give you the opportunity to ask questions about that as well. It's really important. I know some of you will be familiar with the single central record and how sometimes some schools will have governors that go in and look at that. If you're not, then Ian's going to flag up and show you what a single central record looks like, and I'll give you some thoughts on perhaps some effective things to do. And of course, the next thing when we walk through the door really is what's the impact of that training? What's the impact of what staff tell me? And we'll think very much around who we might ask, because I think this is one of the key fundamental parts that any governor, when they're in school, can do. Asking those often really straightforward questions can really give you a picture of what is it that the staff here have to help that culture of keeping children safe. So we'll explore that, and I'll give you some thoughts on who you might try and find to ask those questions of. Okay, next slide, please, Ian, if I may. So I'm going to set you a little task, if that's all right, and it's Ian, we might decide 10 minutes is perhaps more appropriate, because we might want to be thinking about timing for the rest of the day. But in essence, the fact that you're all here today, I'm hoping means that you can check your own school's website. And then these are the things that I'm going to ask you to both try and find. How quickly can you find them? How easy are they to find? Can you find the policy, safeguarding policy? Is it in date? And is potentially, for some of you, if you are the safeguarding governor, is your name there as a contact point? Is it an appropriate contact point, i.e. a school email? Or is it the named safeguarding lead along with other key staff in that role? So that's a kind of a starting point there. What else does your website, your current website, contain that has that kind of information to suggest? Because there's no checklist beyond certain documents to say these are the things we must have. I think we run the risk now, don't we, of perhaps you might turn around and say, is there enough? Is there too much? Is it relevant? Is it pertinent? Does it meet the needs of the community that we work with? That might be a question. How easy those resources and statements, etc., are to find. And then finally, who are they for? Is there evidence, information, documents there for, yes, staff, for perhaps parents, and have any of those websites got information there for children? So I'm going to hope that what you're comfortable to do really is to perhaps take yourselves off, should we say 10 minutes, Ian? Do you think that's a better amount of time? Accepting that you're not going to get through all of that as a list. But if you like to have 10 minutes, log on to your school's website and just have a look. How easy is it to find things? Where are those things? What's there? And how does it give you that absolute surety that, well, there's information here that suggests to me from an outside looking in that this is a robust environment before I've even walked through the door. Has anybody got any questions on either what I'm hoping you're happy to do, or indeed anything that you want to ask to me? Ian, can we head back into the slides, please? Would that be okay? And then we'll, I think, start the recording again. So if we take a break in about 10 minutes time, hopefully a chance to kind of get away from your screen, grab a drink and a comfort break. Brilliant. Okay, so So what else is inspection going to do? And again, remember, the reason why I'm posing these questions, and this isn't a complete list. Please don't think this is the definitive list. This is through my knowledge and understanding of inspection. This is through kind of knowing and working within that system, and indeed, obviously, the feedback that we get from schools who have been inspected. But I think, so please, this is a flavour of what we're going to be doing. So, in essence, training. Both for those in the designated and deputy role, that's really important, but also, of course, those other members of staff who are working in the school. And remember, volunteers as well. What information do they get? Induction, how does that look? What staff that are new to the school? Records. Now, this is a very sensitive point because this is back to that eyes on, hands off. Are records kept to ensure that safeguarding role is timely, effective, and appropriate? You should not know anything about individual children or families. However, arguably, you need to know that those who are keeping those records are acting appropriately. Some of you will have utilised things like very much kind of, oh, goodness gracious me, the phrase has gone from my mind, and it's case studies, anonymised case studies. And I think, again, these things can be very, very useful as discussion points where no individual is mentioned, but leaders perhaps can share with an example of child A or a child in year 5, if that's an appropriate way to kind of anonymise children, so that you have got that understanding of how records are used and how indeed they're collected, and not just by those in the safeguarding role. Data is a strength often of governing boards. And it's something that we look at in a range of ways. But what about things like attendance? What about things like rates of exclusion? What about rates of, for instance, physical intervention by staff who are trained in appropriate ways to kind of, if we do need to intervene? What about thinking very much that if you've got students who are on part-time timetables, those children perhaps that for all sorts of reasons aren't in school full-time, and there's a part-time timetable or indeed alternative provision is in place? How can we use that data to almost track information and again ask questions? Is that appropriate? Is that improving? Is that in decline? Why? What are the reasons possibly for that? Because sometimes things are going to change. Early help. So we're thinking now very much for children where we recognise need. Are school leaders, are those in the safeguarding role accessing early help, and where are the challenges for that? Because as most of you will know, because the media is full of, sadly, percentages and statistics about the rise in the need for early help services, thinking about perhaps use of substances, including alcohol, domestic abuse, thinking about people's mental health in the last kind of 18 months. And that's not a criticism, it's simple fact, unfortunately, that for a number of families, that's having a very negative impact on the children. So how are schools accessing, or what are the barriers to them accessing? And again, as governor, you can be the kind of the advocate for that conversation. The one I hope that we feel really comfortable about, and these are so important, is what does it look like around those behaviours between adults and children? And when I say behaviours, I mean, kind of, you know what you know here, don't you? I suppose the other qualification I've got to be in this role, and I hope a number of you feel and agree with, is I've got a 9-year-old. And when I kind of walk into a school and I look at that relationship between staff and children, does it look right? Equally, what does it look like between children? A number of you will be parents. A number of you will have got kind of relatives that are children, grandchildren. A number of you will have we've all been children ourselves. What does that look and feel like? How is it we see children behaving in and around each other? Does it support, as it says there, that safe culture? I can't describe this in any other way than you really know when that doesn't look right or doesn't feel right. But what is it that makes it a safe culture? And again, those are the types of things I think we should be confident to kind of look at. Gut feeling. There's a phrase for it. I'm sure lots of us have had that kind of feeling before. So don't be afraid. Don't shy away from that, because you can't measure it. Don't shy away from it. And then the final one, and I do hope this happens again, is when we're actually able to talk to children. Of course, we can talk to children now, but it's very much around that. Do children feel safe in school? When I come and work in your schools, I'll ask a straightforward question, and it is, do you feel safe in school? And children will unanimously, pretty much on every occasion, whatever school I go to, thankfully, you'll be pleased to know, say yes. And my next question is, can you tell me why? And the range of answers then start, we're then exploring, It is to do with the fact that adults are here to look after us. It is to do with the fact that there's a great fence around the school so nobody can get in. It is to do with the fact that we have kind of learning opportunities to talk about this, that, and the other. But for me, those very, very basic questions, which you might, I hope they're not, I don't see them as basic, I think they're really important, are often the ones that are going to give us that kind of information. And I do hope that's one of the ones that when we do move back into school and we can have those conversations, we're confident to have. Top tip there, you're all primary schools. I think we do need to probably work with our older children on that type of question. I was always in awe when I was a head teacher of anybody that taught in foundation stage, because if you ask a 5-year-old if they feel safe, sometimes they'll say, no, I don't. And when they say why, it's because I'm scared of the monster that lives in the toilet. So, we need to kind of interpret some of the answers that children are going to give us. That's not to say don't talk to younger children, but I think certainly if you're wanting to engage in that perhaps for the first time, treat yourself kindly and start with older children who perhaps be able to give you a little bit more of a kind of a response that you're going to be perhaps able to work with. Okay, next slide, please, Ian, if that's all right. And then we're kind of building up to our break. So the question I just want to ask you, and throw this open to a general conversation we have break before we go into time away from the screen, is what else from your experience? You are all experienced people. You've all got experiences of other organisations, and if it helps to kind of write a list on these, that's fine. If not, then by all means don't. But what else are you looking out for? What are the other kind of signs? What are the other things that would suggest, as it says there, because this is the key thing, isn't it? Is safeguarding effective? So anybody happy to put their hand up? What are your thoughts? What are the other things that are going to help us to make that decision that, do you know what, this feels, looks, and there's probably information to say that it's a safe environment, that safeguarding culture here is robust and strong. Any thoughts? Okay, let me see. Who have we got hands from? Okay, Graham, give us a couple of things that immediately come to your mind, if you will.
In another mat I work in, they've got secondary 3 colleges or 2 comprehensives. It's what I would call gang culture, where there are elderly children, i.e. of a secondary age, in a village or a gang. What am I trying to say are you aware of a gang culture in the location that can have an impact on the younger children, is really what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's the recruitment into gangs, and obviously having worked in some of the bigger cities around the world, you can see gang culture starts at a very low level with young kids, and it fits in with the drug issue as well, where young kids are groomed and trained to deliver things and that sort of thing. And it's trying to relate what's happening at the older level to give you a feeling of what is there and what is open for the younger children to get involved in. Thank you.
Sure, and in our safeguarding world, we had introduced to us some time ago now a contextualized safeguarding, we call that. What that means is what's going on in the local area, and how does that potentially come into the school through, as Graham described, some of perhaps the behaviours that we see with potentially some of the older children. Yep, good strong start. Anyone else think of anything that they're forgive me, I don't know, another hand up and I can't see whose it is. Ian, I don't know if you can.
It's
mine, I think.
Simon, brilliant. Apologies, I couldn't see that it was your hand, but I can see that hands up. What are you thinking? What might you see, or what can you suggest would support this view?
In a sense, it's to do with how we form that gut judgment, and I try to think of the things which you see very quickly when you arrive at a place, and perhaps one is about posters.
Yeah.
If there is a poster, if it looks new, or certainly if it looks tatty, and one corner's been torn off, or it's just sort of dog-eared, immediately that gives a message. The content might be brilliant, but it just says this hasn't been looked at for a bit. The care with which it's written, if it's got a spelling mistake or it's in Comic Sans, that immediately flashes up for me. Yeah, they haven't really thought it. So it's very hard to put your finger on it, but that would be one thing. I think just if you see that poster, what image does it give of the seriousness with which the topic is taken? I'll stick with that one thing.
No, you're absolutely right. I think we call that attention to detail, don't we? And what we say is, if there's a degree of attention to detail on items such as you've just described, then there's probably attention to detail on the things that we're going to say we definitely should be measuring, if you like. So no, I'm with you. I make a lot of, unfortunately, when I rock up at a school's car park, I'm straight away making judgments on, is there a sign that says, don't smoke while you're on site? Well, that was a long time ago that thing was there. Where's the sign to say all visitors please report to reception? That's the one I'm looking for, if indeed it's appropriate. So no, absolutely good spot. Kirsten, you've got a hand up as well, please.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that most of the things I've noted down are not quantifiable, really. It's all about that gut feeling. And for me, it's things like, do the children seem happy? Are the teachers visible? Are they communicating with everybody? It's things that you hear. So as a governor, I obviously try not to get involved in these conversations with parent groups, but what are the parents talking about? What is there a theme? Is there one particular year group that seem to be upset when going into school? Why might that be? Are we seeing bullying in school, and how do people feel that that's being handled? And it's just about getting that impression about, are we really caring about our children, and is that demonstrated and displayed from the moment you walk in? But it's little things as well, like Simon was saying about the poster. I noticed recently we did our school did a collection for football boots, and in the photograph that was put on social media was the photo of our main school sign, and it was filthy. And it was just that immediate, we really need to get that cleaned, because that doesn't set a good impression. Little things.
I think they're so important, and I think you're equally, if you've been at a school for a long time, either as a governor or a member of staff, it's a bit like in your own homes, isn't it? If you've got pictures on the wall, you're probably not even seeing those pictures anymore. Subconsciously, they're not even there. And when visitors come to your house, oh, that's a nice picture, and you think, oh, I suppose it is. And therefore, the role of governance here is so important, isn't it? Especially those of you that are new governors. When you go to site for the first time, you are going to be asking the questions that most people potentially have now stopped asking. So I think, hold on to that thought. That's a really fundamental part of making this decision. So we might be, some of us thinking, God, this is in real minutiae. Actually, yes, to a degree it is. But what we're also saying is, if those things aren't right, then we're probably starting to make an initial conclusion that other things aren't right as well. That might be wrong, but wouldn't it be great if both were right? And that early impression, what's the expression about, the importance of a first impression? So I think they're fundamental. Okay, we've got time for one more quick bit of feedback, unless we don't get any, and then obviously we'll go to break, which is almost an encouragement not obviously to say anything, isn't it? Because who wants their break delayed now? But is there anybody else that's got something that they desperately like to share about this question, of the types of things that you might be seeing that aren't on my list to date that you thought, or should we call it a dead break? Okay. Then no hands have gone up, so slides back up for us, please, and we'll pick up the pace as we go through them. I don't want to dwell on anywhere for too long, but equally I want to give everything a bit of an airing. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So DSL, Designated Safeguarding Lead. I think very much of designated safeguarding leads as a subject leader. And when I say subject leader, that means for me that they are in the position of knowing, having more, greater knowledge than perhaps other members of staff, because of course they've had training, but there's a strong likelihood as well, isn't there, that they've got greater experience in this field of work. So that's what we're, for the purposes of this conversation, going to refer to them as. Often, not exclusively, they might be the head teacher as well, but that doesn't have to be the case. We've still got a current requirement. There has to be a designated safeguarding lead and a deputy designated safeguarding lead in every school. So that is a legal requirement. So it may well be that you're talking to the deputy DSL. That's fine, but there must be a named DSL. And as a number of you have just worked out, that should be shown in your policy along with any deputies and their contact details. That's why it's there. Okay, so types of things I'm thinking you might be able to work with your DSLs on. And please, again, this isn't a kind of a definitive list of questions. This is very much a summary for you to interpret, and indeed some of the terminology for you to interpret. So, what are the challenges? And I think that's a really good starting question. What have been the challenges in last 12 months, 18 months, 6 months? You come up with a timescale that you feel is appropriate. And how have these changed as we've gone through that kind of crazy roller coaster of out, in, out, in? Because that's kind of where we are now, isn't it? We've got that real kind of transition between the challenges when children weren't all in school and some were, and obviously now as children have come back, and in particular now that they've been back at school for a good number of weeks, where are things now? Staff training. There is a requirement that staff training has been kept up to date throughout the pandemic. And of course, much of that's going to be delivered or have been delivered or offered through virtual means. But let's just think about who we might want to be specific about here as we move back into actually going into the school setting. For me, never, ever, ever, ever start with staff training with teachers or senior staff. Absolute waste of your time if you want to ask questions about training. I would encourage you to start with staff such as mealtime assistants, such as perhaps volunteers other than obviously yourselves, thinking very much around perhaps if there are part-time staff, support staff. What about staff who work in and around the office environment? The reason why I'm encouraging you to start there is because that's what Ofsted are likely to do. Why are we doing this? Not because of what Ofsted tell us, but because ultimately, if I speak to a mealtime assistant who is likely to be in the school grounds for an hour a day, and they can give me a really robust answer to tell me what training they've had, and then when we ask them, and does it support you in your role? I think there's a strong likelihood that as we move backwards in terms of towards school leaders, those answers are going to be confirmed, but also get stronger and stronger. And I think for me, that's a very, very simple principle because Ofsted will do that. So do we get the opportunity to do that? Think very much around who might in your school setting that you're supporting those adults be where maybe, and this is going to sound awful, and please take this in the context of this man, who can we pick on in the nicest possible sense to verify that the culture of training in this school isn't just for staff who are in the school 5 days a week, 39 weeks of the school year. Because as we know, safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. And as a governing board, our responsibility is to verify that that is the case. So that would be a great way in which to do that. And again, please work with your kind of DSLs, your school leaders, to how you're going to do that. Please don't see any of this as I'm coming in to inspect you and I'm not telling you what to do. No, 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 no. This is in partnership. But at the same time, we need to be perhaps a little bit more prescriptive about where we ask some of those questions. Would be my advice to you. It's advice. Are staff confident about how to share a concern? Now, CPOM stands for Child Protection Online Management System, of which a good number of your schools have that as an electronic system by which staff can share concerns. It's a database. It creates a chronology. But ultimately, again, thinking about some of those staff, mealtime assistants, are they confident that that's what they need to do? And if they don't do that, okay, who and how are they making sure that any concerns that they've got known are being reported? I hope you agree with me that often children actually will show us the potential signs or symptoms with other staff than those class teachers who they're with all the time. For some children, of course, if they're trying to hide those signs and symptoms, they're going to be hiding it from perhaps those people who they see as the authority figure in their school environment, which will, in my experience, often be the head teacher, the senior team, or potentially class teachers. I'm being very sweeping in my statements, forgive me, but I think there is an element of certainly my professional experiences that is the case. And I think then the final question is always an important question, and this is something that we are by default interested in. But I think it's an important point to remember is what about asking about the welfare and well-being of the designated safeguarding lead? Now, don't get me wrong, we've all had, I'm sure, times in the last 12, 18 months and continue to have when for all sorts of reasons we have felt, goodness gracious me, this is getting really challenging now. I'm thinking very much here around their well-being within their professional role. How are they getting support? Who are they getting that from? Thinking about the systems that the trust have got. So, Ian has quite kindly talked about the fact that we work in partnership. Are they able to? Do they know the contact details, for instance, to who to pick up in my team? I've got those as one of the last slides so that you can see them, because that's what we're sharing. But where are your designated safeguarding leaders getting their support? Because as a good number of you, if you don't know, you can certainly imagine, if we're working with families where there is significant abuse taking place, that's going to have a personal impact on the individuals, as well as the needs of a staff group who are going to be finding, this is pretty difficult stuff. Okay, next slide, please, Ian, if I may. So we're going to quickly now pop back into your kind of breakout rooms, if that's okay, because I'm going to ask you two really quick questions here, which is, what do you know about the school already? Because you've got, as the trust has developed, a really good example of a monitoring sheet, and you could interpret that as a go-to in terms of, does it again structure some of those questions? And I like it because it's absolutely what it says on the tin. It is a structured document that you can use. What I suppose I'm encouraging you to think through as well is, where else can you get information from? So section 175 audit, what's that? Let me briefly explain. What is it? It's the requirement of every local authority, regardless. So in Devon, as you know, we've got Plymouth, Devon and Torbay, to seek assurances from its schools about its practice and procedures for safeguarding. It's section 175 of the amended now 2002 Education Act. And what's important about that, of course, is it's very much the schools. Now in Plymouth, it's at every 2 years, but I'm going to refer to it as your kind of MOT. In other words, it's a self-evaluation. It is a tick list to a degree. It does ask you to reflect on what you as a school setting are doing, and there should be nothing in there that you couldn't see as governors. So what is it may be that would tell you. So the question is, what else can you support in your monitoring? So the question I'm going to ask you, when you're going, how can you use questions? What else, who else, where else can you ask things that might be of benefit to the school leaders, the safeguarding lead? Because again, what we're doing here is we're going in with the mindset of, I'm here to verify what you're telling me, what you're showing me. I am here to support that view, and by default, by questioning it, I am supporting. So if I can just ask you for perhaps 3 or 4 minutes, no longer, and again, apologies when you get plucked from those rooms, it's a horrible experience, I know, if you're mid-sentence, but just what are the types of questions you could be asking? And the question is, and who could you be asking them of? Because I think, again, this now takes you, yes, you've got your structured kind of monitoring sheet, but you'll know your schools, you'll know your settings, you'll know perhaps a bit more about the local community, to just start kind of phrasing some of those questions. So Ian, if you're happy to, after today, we'll pop in an email for you. You've got a section 175, which is a whole host of questions, predominantly against guidance from keeping children safe, local authority kind of requirements, to sculpt and enable you to ask questions and look at information. But I'm trying to move beyond some of that to a degree. So what are the types of questions that you've shared with each other? Is anybody, perhaps, I know, again, this is not about picking on people, but anybody who's not perhaps managed to share anything with us this morning is feeling brave and happy to join in, please do. What are the types of questions? What are the types of areas? What could you be looking at that would give you that? Remember, let's come back to that word culture. What's the culture like at this place?
I'll start the ball rolling because basically, working in other MATs, I can see best practice there, and I share best practice. And like being chair of a board committee, like audit and risk, it can be a lonely role. But I think there is, whilst the organisation itself has its own network for staff who are involved in safeguarding, run internally, maybe there's a requirement for a network, an occasional quarterly virtual meeting for those governors who have this responsibility, so they can talk to colleagues from other local governing bodies about their experiences and share best practice at their level. Because if you've just got that role within a local governing body, it can also be a lonely role. So that's my contribution anyway.
Yeah. I think that's something that I know Ian has been working really hard on in terms of forums for those safeguarding leads in schools to come together and share that practice, because ultimately there are certain things that we have to do, and there are certain things that we often do alongside or above and beyond that. So
I'm making the appeal on behalf of local governing body governors that they need an opportunity to meet and talk.
Yeah, and I think what I was doing there, Graham, was I was aligning it to that model and saying that certainly to me sounds like a sensible way forward, using an existing kind of format, i.e. a forum, I think we call it loosely, to do just that. Yeah, good idea. Anybody else want to share perhaps part of the conversation that they've just had around? So, okay, what else can your monitoring do? monitoring is a horrible word, isn't it? Because I'm watching, I'm looking. But what else might you be doing when you visit schools? Who else might you be talking to? What are the other things that you could be doing to gain that? I think, Kirsten said, yeah, that gut feeling. Where does that come from? What could you be doing to gather that? Any other thoughts? Oh, forgive me. I can't see whose hand that is that's gone up. So whoever you are, please make yourself known.
It's me. We had some really interesting conversations. Kirsten was talking about looking at the themes that are coming through from the monitoring process and that monitoring document, whether it's disadvantaged pupils that are
perfect
there, and whether it's boys or girls, and all of those kind of key themes that we look at. And we also took it a step further as well and pulled in sort of looking at Senko, and if you've got children who have that, like the triggers and those plans in place, and that takes it on to staff. With we were saying earlier about making sure that staff are safe and then the child feels safe. So we kind of extrapolated it quite wide, and I think both Kirsten and Yvonne and myself came to the conclusion that actually you could take it whichever way, because the golden thread, as you said earlier,
love it,
runs through everything, doesn't it?
Yeah, good, Amy. That's really good. And I think equally, this is where again it's that bit around those kind of those really powerful conversations where actually what you're saying now is this doesn't sit on its own. If I think about the topic of school improvement, probably for each of you in your settings, you will have had information about groups who are vulnerable to not making the progress that we want them to make, and they often fit in that pupil premium, which you said, and SEND group, learners with specific needs. And actually, if we added safeguarding into that as well, in other words, those children where we think there are vulnerabilities about their kind of well-being, I think you've probably then got a really good reflection of where some of those concerns might sit. Love it, love it, love it, love it. Good stuff. Anybody else who hasn't spoken, happy to share anything before we move on? I don't want to miss that opportunity for somebody that's bursting to share something. And at the same time, I appreciate there's some of you that haven't had the chance to share yet. It's not a kind of you have to, but obviously it's lovely if we do get contributions from everyone. That does sound like a kind of, didn't mean that. No. Okay. Okay, then we'll move on. So, Ian, are you happy to share the next slide, please? And I think then we go back on to record. That's okay. So, COVID. Let's have a think about COVID. Let's kind of now. So we've talked about the broader picture. Now we have to acknowledge the fact that there are going to be a number of differences, nuances, and things that have happened throughout the pandemic that we might either be asked about or indeed we would want to ask about. So let's just drill into some of this if I can. Now, it is important, isn't it, that we recognise that for a number of the families that the school work with, that they are going to have attended school throughout. And we're going to have a range of knowledge about how they, and indeed through their family environment, have kind of coped a really, really challenging time. But let's just kind of pick out some of the key bits. And again, as with all that I'm saying today, nothing is a kind of a complete list. This is very much a summary. So the first thing is how have we kept records through the pandemic? And each local authority at a different point in time at the start, back in kind of probably the end of March into early April, will have had requirements about that record keeping process and how it ties in more likely with wider agencies. So in other words, we're now thinking about children's social care. We don't want to see those records. Absolutely, that's the kind of the eyes on. We don't want to be having the kind of seeing them. Sorry, that's the hands off. What we do need to do though is we need to be able to talk with confidence about what was required of the school and setting. And again, what were the challenges of that? I think it's a very sensible question, isn't it? We want to make sure that we've got a good understanding of that definition of the vulnerable children that were offered places. Now, some of you might be aware that there was kind of a little bit of a DFE guidance on this in terms of this is the definition of vulnerability that was fed through local authorities. But quite rightly, and I think this is one of the absolute things to celebrate about the last 12 months, is that school leaders were making places available to children that because they didn't necessarily fulfill the criteria, but because what we knew of those families, we were able to offer them places in school. We did encourage them to come in and attend, even though that might have meant that we had a greater number of children in school that, of course, had an impact on staffing levels and so on and so forth. But I do think, as a governor looking at safeguarding, I would want to have a flavour of what that looked like for your school. And again, that's going to be very, very localised to the school that you work with and support. I think it was Kirsten talked, or somebody talked earlier, forgive me, about kind of the different policies. You had amendments, you had kind of, well, that came out then, and then we had to do that, and we had to understand and accept that. You know, how have they been shared with staff? What was that physical process? And how was it kind of actioned? So one of the things that, for instance, because I wrote those policies, one of the things that was required at the time was very much a bit around, we should know who the safeguarding lead is on site today. Some of you will have been to kind of organisations where they'll have, you know, duty person today, or this person's in, this person's out. How did that physically get communicated at a time when we didn't necessarily have all the staff in school? And was it effective? In other words, if it wasn't the safeguarding lead that was in today, but it was the deputy, how did staff know, and can we evidence how that happened? Because ultimately, we signed off on a policy. The question I'm going to say is, so what? Where's the evidence of the impact of that? And was it appropriate? Was it effective? Did it need to be changed? The last couple of things then, that DSL role ensured suitable actions, even though we were potentially working remotely, or even though we were needing to attend things like, you know, some meetings that you might have heard of, child in need meetings, child protection meetings, what are called strategy meetings. Were those actions still undertaken where we needed to? And again, without knowing the details, during this period of time, because clearly what we're going to be potentially challenged on, the phrase that we've heard time and time again is, it should have been business as usual. In terms of safeguarding, you know, nothing was stepped down or suspended during that period of time. You'll be familiar with perhaps some of the code of practice for safeguarding at a period of time. It didn't have changes made to it. That's not the case for safeguarding. So, you know, can we have an understanding of how that happened? And the final point, we're going to build on this in a minute with looking at single central record, is, can we evidence that recruitment, because most of your schools, I suspect, thinking about an 18-month period, will have recruited at least one person during this period of time. And again, was that recruitment undertaken in line with, as it says there, Keeping Children Safe Part 3, which, if you're interested, is where you could find more of the detail about what that looks like. I'll talk that through in a bit more detail in a second, because ultimately, of course, we want to make sure we've got that safe staff, safe school. You know, that question I asked you at the beginning, are the adults suitably vetted to ensure that they are safe to work with children? That's a key role of leadership, and therefore one that as governors we need to absolutely clarify. Next slide, please, if you will, Ian. Great. So we don't know how long inspection, and again, the reason I'm saying, what has this got to do with inspection? Well, there's got to come a point where we stop talking about COVID, I hope. I hope many of you kind of are looking forward to that time. The time will come where we don't talk about this yet. Thank you, Simon. We know we're not talking about this because it's going to suddenly go away, but there will come a time where we need to make that distinction between, that's how we managed a particular period of time, and this is how now we're pushing forwards. But I think it's very, very likely that for any of you that have some form of external kind of scrutiny, be that inspection or otherwise, at least until the new year, we're going to be asking those questions about, well, what happened during that period to ensure that learners are safe, that staff are safe. So some questions again to help scope that, and I hope again these are there for you to interpret and to utilise or not as you see appropriate. But what role did and have governors had during the pandemic? Because I think in some ways, quite rightly, governors have needed to, certainly the board where I'm a governor, we've had a very clear message from the chair of governors. This is actually about us supporting school leaders more than the challenge. You will have heard that, you know, governance is about the supportive challenge. I think understandably through this point, we've leaned towards the supportive statement and perhaps not challenged as much. So how does that look? What is the evidence of that? Minutes of meetings and so on and so forth. Some of you will have had virtual conversations of all manner of nature with school leaders, but I think that's important. We've talked in the previous slide, how confident / comfortable are you to articulate, and again, we're talking about a summary now of the things that the school has done to make sure that that is the case. Could the safeguarding lead, could the governing board have that kind of level of understanding? Not in masses of detail, but certainly I think we do need to understand how those things work. That's really important. Again, those partial closures, what changed? How did it change? How have those, as it says here in the DSL role, been able to undertake their duties? What were the potential barriers? What about how did we manage potentially staff sickness? Some of you will have worked in school environments where the DSL, the designated safeguarding lead, was indeed perhaps themselves off unwell for a period of time. Did that system of the deputy DSL, the deputy safeguarding lead, kick in? In other words, it sounds terrible, doesn't it? But did that demonstrate that your measures, the training that they have as well, actually stood up? And what did we learn from that? Recruitment has obviously continued, and how do we know? Some of you will take part, I know, in recruitment processes. You'll be involved in interviews and the different kind of tasks and activities that go with that. But can we talk about not just first-hand experiences, but where is the evidence that that's the case? Did children feel safe at school? Those that were attending school, I know my son went to school right the way throughout this. Very, very fortunate in that regard. And he had a lovely time in the first lockdown because it wasn't the normal kind of curriculum. And from his point of view, the sun shone and he was outside kicking a ball around. Brilliant. What's not to like? But actually, were safety measures, were the appropriate kind of things still in place, even as that curriculum then changed slightly on what children were perhaps doing, that childcare structure that schools were encouraged to think about in the first phase? How can we still evidence that? Because the safeguarding aspect, as I've said, shouldn't have changed. And again, appropriate information for the safeguarding governor, is it evidence is effective? In other words, this is what our policy says. Well, that's great. I think somebody said earlier, I can read. That's one thing. Actually, does it look like in practice? Did it get reported in practice? That was what was happening. And I think that is a kind of a question to take away from today, if I can be as bold as to say, it's not about we're not trusting leaders. I'm not saying that for a second. What we're saying is we want to support leaders by saying, not only do I kind of have read this and have signed off on it as part of the governing board, but actually I've seen it in practice. And I think that's crucial. That's crucial. Okay, next slide, please, if I may. Thank you. So what I'm going to ask you to do, and again, I'm just going to give you an opportunity perhaps to work in another breakout room very quickly, going to give you 5 minutes, is where's the balance? Now, I'm going to give you my opinion on this, and then you can challenge me in your own mind, or you can have a conversation and challenge me in a second. But I think one of the things about governance sometimes is we have two types of information. We have reported information, head teachers report, good example. And then we have what I refer to as first-hand information. So we've talked about, I think it was Simon that talked about walking into the building and seeing a dog-eared poster that a member of staff last time said that, yeah, we're going to replace that. Has that happened, or have I just been told it's been replaced? What about talking to children? We've seen a school survey of children's responses. Have I actually talked to some children? That kind of balance between the two, because I think sometimes, especially probably in the last 12, 18 months, we've leaned heavily on the reported information. Quite rightly, that's one of the challenges we faced. Do we now possibly have the opportunity to redress that a little bit with first-hand? In other words, what have we seen or heard for ourselves? My personal view is this is never going to be 50-50, even though this slide suggests, because they're equal measure. I think we're probably working somewhere between, and this is a very inexact science, 2/3 and 1/3. What I mean by that is we have to accept that school leaders are going to report information, and quite rightly, we as governors are going to accept that. But I do think we need to strike that balance as well as testing some of that. So the question I'm going to ask you is, if you can go into Ian, we'll set those rooms up. What is it that you've had reported or have? And again, think back to if those of you that have been in governors before this, and equally, what might those first-hand things be that you could now go back to again to support those reports? And that sounds really silly, but think about the kind of what are these things maybe as we move forward, as we go back into actually being in school. Could we be saying that's an area that would be really good to target's the wrong word, but make a priority to absolutely verify that that is the case. Ian, if you're happy to create those rooms again, to the slides, and we'll carry on with those. Thank you. Yeah, question of the week. Well, following your audit, good stuff. Next slide, please, if I may, sir. Thank you. So we're going to have a look at single central record, and we're going to do this pretty quickly. And the reason I'm going to do it pretty quickly is I'm going to be pretty straightforward in what I'm going to suggest is a good activity to do. So, Ian, somewhere I hope I've sent you an Excel spreadsheet, which is the current version of the single central record that I, in Devon, am responsible for. When I say responsible for, that means update. So the last update is January 21. Some of you might miss this, but this thing called Brexit happened, and turns out that made some requirements around how we recruit people in a slightly different way. If you haven't seen a single central record before, very briefly, what it does is it lists all of your employees, your agency, your contractors, and any volunteers on different tabs. Those are the things that you can see down the bottom of this document. And it requires certain, as it says here, mandatory. Some of these are good practice. Some of these are linked to policy. But in essence, what this is it's a one place, single, central, held by the school. Although in MATS, you have the ability to hold a central single central record, but it must be accessed. Now, I know your current model is that individual schools hold this information themselves. And also you've got a named kind of employee, Hannah, who is actually kind of taking, I think, quite recently, certainly this, I think, calendar year, is taking a role in this, and she's really strong. She knows exactly what she's doing, which is great. So, Ian, do you mind just kind of on that spreadsheet taking us across to the left-hand side in terms of columns, and then we'll just kind of edge our way briefly across. So most of this is linked to the yellow, if we can call it that, is predominantly linked to the DBS check that we're going to do. So schools will be expected to evidence this. As you can see here, then we move into greens, qualifications. Remember, not most staff in a school actually will not need a qualification to be in their role. Teachers, on the other hand, do. We would evidence that. Sorry, and as I kind of finished talking, are you happy to scroll towards the right for me? This is a very whistle-stop tour on this. The blues, this is where we record the actual DBS number, and we're thinking here very much around some other checks. So you've got in there disqualification of the Child Care Act. I don't want to get into detail about that because that's a 10-minute conversation minimum. But there are a number of checks that we're going to be doing here. I'm thinking very much around then in right to work in UK. That's the purple columns. This is the column that's changed slightly because, of course, now what was right to work in UK, i.e. a European Economic Area document or passport prior to January the 1st, moving forward now, we would recruit in a different way to evidence that they have right to work in UK, because, of course, we're outside of the European Union now. Then we have the medical check, which is the, I'm not sure what colour we're going to call that, so I'm going to go for light green because I can't think of a better word. We've then got a Section 128 check. That is pertinent for academies because there will be certain staff who require that because they're in a perhaps leadership or they have a financial responsibility. All governors and directors should have that check against them as well. And there we've got references. Now, as most of you can see, it says policy. What does that mean? What policy means is in keeping children safe, you have to have recorded 2 references for an employee. What you don't have to do is show them in your single central record. My view, and it's one that I think most schools echo, is that's probably one of the most important checks we do for a new employee because, of course, we are now asking somebody who knows them to comment on their suitability to work with children. So what does this mean and what am I hoping to do? So, Ian, can you see on the bottom right-hand side, you've got that kind of slidey bar, which gives us at the moment a percentage. Can you take that one down just so that we can kind of see probably the whole document just about, and you might need to slide there. Yeah, that's perfect. Great. So if you are familiar with a single central record, then please build upon what I'm going to say. If you're not, then, and you are likely or possibly interested, or when you do go in and visit, want to have a look at this, the first thing to do is start it with a conversation. What I mean by that is it is very likely that there'll be a named member of staff in the school whose kind of day job is to manage this. As a rule of thumb, this is a very, very broad rule of thumb. If you take the school, the number of children that are on roll, so for easy numbers, we'll say 200. And if we kind of say 15%, i.e. 30, that's usually about the figure that we would have as employees. So as a rule of thumb, 15% of the school population in terms of children gives you roughly the number of people. So you can see for a 200 people school, somebody is going to be responsible for 30 persons, employees, information. And that's quite a lot of people. Of course, that's not talking about contractors, agency, and volunteers. We're not going to go into detail about that today. The most likely reality when you look at it in kind of this form is we should be seeing no gaps. NA, non-applicable, is not a gap. That means, as it says on the tin, that check is non-applicable, i.e. this is a teaching assistant who doesn't require a teaching qualification, therefore it's NA. But if there are gaps, they will become pretty obvious to you. And the first question to ask if you see a gap is, I noticed that there's a gap there. Can you explain to me why that's the case? There could be a reason for it, i.e. this is a new member of staff, they haven't started yet and we're building them into the single central record. Equally, you might be helping someone saying, I haven't seen that one before, I need to do something about it. What I would encourage you to do, if this is a document that you're thinking it would be great to go in and have a look at, it would be great to go in and support that statement, which is have school leaders ensure that recruitment during the pandemic and this period of time we've had where we haven't been in schools has adhered to those things. Is quite simply, I always say this, please can you tell me who's your most recently appointed member of staff? Well, it's Mr. Smith. He's a teaching assistant currently working in Key Stage 2. Brilliant. And then quite simply what we want to do is say, and I would encourage this to be something that you're comfortable to do because you've had that conversation. Can you please, can we have a look at their personnel file? Remember, those are the documents that actually we print off and hold physically in the school. And in essence, what we're saying is, this is what you're saying, this is what I'm saying. Okay, so I can see for Mr. Smith that you've got something in each box, even if it's an NA, but it's a complete kind of line for Mr. Smith. Can you show me the documents in that file that demonstrate those checks are accurate? In other words, if we're saying 2 references, we should be able to see evidence of 2 references. Now, I know across the trust now we've started developing that through an electronic source, that's fine, but we should be able to evidence those checks. We're saying we've got something for right to work in UK, i.e. a passport. Is there a copy of that passport on the file? We're saying, according to the single central record, that they've undertaken a medical kind of clearance, which is a self-declaration. Most of you, or most schools will be printing something off. What I'm encouraging you to think through is look at somebody that's been appointed within the last 12 months. And in essence, I'm saying prove it. You're not going to say prove it. Is, can you show me where the documents are in that file that demonstrate that we've maintained those checks? Because ultimately, this is something that inspectors are going to do. And I think it's a really healthy thing if you are in the safeguarding role. I'm not suggesting all governors do this for a second. I think that would be quite inappropriate. But for those of you that are or are likely to go into the safeguarding role, having an understanding of how this works is a really useful means, because, of course, what you want to verify, we're back to, where am I getting reported information? Where am I getting my own information? To be able to say that you've looked at a recently appointed member of staff's file and that there's evidence of all of the checks, I think is quite a powerful statement from that first-hand point of view. I really don't today want to go into masses of more detail about that, but what I do want to do is give you the opportunity to ask any questions. Kristen, when I had my vetting checks, etc., school administrator said couldn't keep documents, copies of e.g. passport in the file. Okay, so Kristen, unfortunately, to make matters more complicated, which is why I'm backing away from this conversation for the purposes of this audience today, there are certain different nuances between employees, staff, and volunteers. For employees, we are expected to keep copies of things like passport. Equally, for nobody should we be keeping a copy of the original DBS. So we don't take photocopies of somebody's DBS. What we do instead is we record the number. I don't know if that helps and answers your question, but certainly for volunteers, we're not expected to do that. However, we're expected to do a DBS, we're expected to see those documents, we're expected, if we won't go into that because I just think we've got time, but very much so, yeah, there are certain GDPR changes, differences, and always have been, even before we went through GDPR, and it was just called data protection, which of course GDPR still is, but it's an update. Any other questions that anybody wants to ask that you feel are pressing about this before we go back to the slides? I think it's a bit of a summary today. I don't want to go into huge detail. Ian, is there anything you want to add to that?
Just to add, yeah, just to remind governors that the employee tab is managed by Hannah Hobson centrally. The volunteers, governors, contractors, agency tabs are managed by staff in schools because that's more dynamic and much more local and up to date. So we are, between us, John and myself and Hannah, keeping an eye on the whole document for the schools, but it's important that you know which bits sit with the school and which bits sit centrally.
Okay. Any other questions on single central record, personnel files, or recruitment? One of the things I haven't said is that throughout the process of recruitment, we should have a named individual that has a safer recruitment initial qualification. That is a statutory requirement in schools and colleges. So there should be somebody in the school, often it's more than one person, often that's amongst the governing board as well, who will hold a safer recruitment qualification. Sadly, some of you will remember a place called Soham. Sadly, some of you will remember Two Girls, Hollywell's Jessica Chapman, and then we had the Bashard report about, where were the failings? And of course, one of the key things there was, we have to have school leaders who understand and have done that initial training. So, okay. I'm taking silencers. Got it. Thanks a lot. We'll find out some more. Let's crack on. Yeah. Motion carried. Okay, we'll roll with that then, please, Ian, if I may, sir. There, we'll go back into the slides. Not many to go now before I want to give you that opportunity to ask questions. So, next slide, please. Culture. We've talked a reasonable amount today about culture. Now, I think it's a word that I hope you are happy to take away with you when we're thinking about monitoring. What are we monitoring? Well, clearly, we're monitoring a whole range of things, but put all of those things together, and actually what we're saying is it is the culture, and therefore working with the leadership team. Remember, I talked about senior designated safeguarding leaders as subject leader. I think I would hope you see yourself as part of that culture in how you come in and ask those really pertinent, really useful questions, but also, as we've established today, the observations of the things that aren't necessarily always part of a checklist, aren't always part of the kind of glaringly obvious through a policy, and I think that's important. Therefore, what are the things that you see and hear are equally as important? I think, Kirsty, you described this, your gut feeling. Most of us have been to a restaurant and we've walked in the door and we've sometimes thought, I'm not sure whether this meal is going to be any good today before we've seen any food. And I think, I hope that analogy works for you sometimes in the opposite, which is, do you know what, I've walked in today and before I've almost got through the doors, the welcome, the kind of the directions into the school, the expectations around my visit, just how I was greeted today with the information that's available to me is already making me feel that there's a very strong culture here. Let's carry on with that mindset. I think that's a really healthy starting point. Equally, if we do have concerns, how do we address them? We should be sharing those with the head teacher. If we do see something, hear something, because clearly, we don't know whether that is a one-off. We don't know whether that's something that perhaps is ongoing. So we do need that kind of ability and that confidence to do just that. Sadly, sometimes we do need to make sure that our role isn't just to see stuff that's great. If we do see something that's causing us concern immediately, we need to do something about that. Equally, if it's something perhaps that you don't understand, ask questions. I hope, Richard, I'm sorry, Richard, to pick on you here, but I'm hoping you'd be absolutely confident, comfortable to be able to discuss things that the governors come in and need more information about. And I'm sure you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's a really important part of that understanding of what we do and how we do it. I'm referring now, please, this is a difficult one. I'm not saying mealtime assistants are difficult people. They're not. They manage one of the most difficult times of the day. I think you would probably agree with that. What I'm saying is, those hard to reach groups, I've defined them as the people that perhaps are part-time, not because that's an issue, just because they're not always at school, therefore they're accessing training. What about perhaps some of your cleaners? What about some of your kitchen staff? What about staff who perhaps aren't necessarily working with children all the time, but yet have that safeguarding role and responsibility? If we're going to be asking questions of individuals, I'm going to be very direct with you. We do want to ask questions of those people because that will give us, I think, a better reflection of what the school is doing to make sure that people are, as it says, they're professionally curious, than if I start with a teacher. And that's not saying teachers know more, it's saying that actually they're there more. So I think that's a piece of advice that I hope you'll take away with you if you feel it's pertinent. And again, I think this is important. How do we, school leaders, utilise you guys as that critical friend? I think that's part of the culture. A healthy culture of a school is where school leaders recognise the impact and actually how much value, good quality, highly challenging in a professional sense governance bring to a school environment. An absolute fundamental process. And while at times it can feel a bit uncomfortable as a school leader, I'm saying that from my experience. Governors are asking all these difficult questions, but by default, it does give you the opportunity to demonstrate that leadership is not just effective, but it's really moving the school in the direction that we've established. Okay, next slide, please, sir. So, a way to think about that is this, and I suppose it's right now when you're thinking of your school that you support. What would a school kind of feel? What would it be able to show in the first hour of inspection? Given that if it's a Section 8 inspection, it's likely to be a day. If it's a Section 5, it could be across 2 days. But within that first hour, and remember, we're not saying this is because of inspection, we're aligning inspection to some of our kind of the things that we can see and do as well. We're not pretending to be Ofsted. What we're saying is, well, what they do is kind of what governance would do anyway. What do they see in the first hour? If you went in, when you go in next, ask yourself almost, after an hour, okay, what can I satisfy myself today that I've seen that suggests the culture of this school is one where safeguarding is absolutely at the core of everything it does. We've talked about golden threads. We've talked about across a range of policies and procedures. We've talked about how is that reflected in attendance, in pupil premium kind of information stroke data, in send information stroke data. And again, without knowing anything about individual children, what does that look like within the hour? And the next thing is, I suppose, and this is in some ways a question for some of you that are the safeguarding governor, is if you are able in a 20-minute meeting with an inspector, what are the key points that you would want to get across other than just, and I think this is the danger of that kind of support and challenge. Of course, we want to say that our leaders, our DSLs, our designated safeguarding leaders, are doing a great job. But what we also need to be able to do is back that up with, and this is how I know. And I think that's the bit to kind of mix those two things away. So yeah, again, in 20 minutes, what would be, and it might be a point of reflection for some of you from today, what would I want to get across that doesn't just sound like, but aren't they doing a brilliant job? Because that's great. What I need to do is be a bit more kind of strategic in that conversation, and I need to demonstrate how, where that evidence has come from, including, of course, reported evidence, information, but also thinking very much around, and I've seen this, I've actually gone and checked that, I spoke to a group of children, and you can start, I hope to see how that conversation is in two parts. This is what I know, this is why. Any questions, any thoughts on the culture of your schools that you work with? And I appreciate for some of you, this is not an unusual concept, but anything about culture before we finish off the slides and say open it up to more general questions about any of the content from today? Okay, great. Ian, next slide, please, sir. Thank you. So, when I think about governance and when I think about schools and the impact that it can have, I heard this nearly, I've changed it a little bit, but the influence of one of our team here at Babcock, we were talking to some kind of school effectiveness colleagues. I thought this was really interesting. Outstanding head teachers and senior leaders enable a school to be good. I'm thinking on Ofsted grading. Outstanding governance can raise the bar to outstanding. And I quite like that, because what it says to me, and I say this as somebody that's been a head teacher, is that I, of course, if I'm any good, I can really promote the learning opportunities, that broad and balanced curriculum, that engagement with parents and local community. I can do all of that, and I can work tirelessly and endlessly, and I can absolutely get it to a really good place. But I do think that what I hope today does is recognise the role within the safeguarding contents, that if we're going to get it now, safeguarding isn't judged. It's effective or ineffective, but it's part of the bigger picture, isn't it? And I do think it's helpful to remind us as volunteers who've given you time up today, just how important you are to a school and how you're important to what happens for those children, young people, and indeed the staff who attend there and the local community. I think it is a really, I hope, useful point to the importance of your role. Ian, I think we're on to nearly the last slide. Before we come back to questions, do you mind showing the one with our contact details as a team, just so that people know where we are? So that's kind of me, and that's my colleagues, Lara and Caroline. Our contact details are there. Our email details are there. These are with your schools, and we're very much encouraging school leaders to get in touch with us from a safeguarding point of view if they have questions. But I just wanted to reference the fact when you get slides, if you've got any questions for me today. Unfortunately, my email address hasn't been changed. I'm not Jon Galling. I'm actually Jonathan.Galling. So it's JONATHAN.Galling at Babcock International. But those numbers are right. So if you want to give me a ring, if there's anything that I can help you with or advise or indeed any questions you've got after today, then please do get back in touch. Otherwise, Ian, if we can hit the question button and just open the floor up to everyone for 5 or 10 minutes, however long you need, and I'll answer questions as best I can. Otherwise, that really is it from me. I hope it's been useful, but chance for some questions. And remember, no silly questions. Never a silly question, just a question you don't know the answer to. So anybody got anything that they'd like to